This is an audio recording of the 2013 INET Policy Forum, Employment Instability and the Safety Net, held on November 15, 2013. INET is the Employment Instability, Family Well-Being, and Social Policy Network, which is housed at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. This policy forum will summarize research evidence on the interaction between employment instability and the safety net in the United States. The keynote speakers are Kathryn Edin from Harvard University and H. Luke Shaefer from the University of Michigan. They discussed rising extreme poverty. Is the employment-based safety net partly to blame?
I'm Marcia Ibarra. Thank you again for attending INET's Forum on Employment Instability. We're thrilled that you could make it. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Social Service Administration and also an INET member. I have the extreme pleasure of introducing our keynote luncheon speakers, Dr. Kathryn Edin and Dr. Luke Shaefer. Kathy Edin is a professor of public policy and management at Harvard Kennedy School. Her research focuses on urban poverty and family life, social welfare, housing, child support, and urban poverty. Her new book, Doing the Best I Can, Fatherhood in the City, is a multi-year ethnographic study of low-income married fathers. Her previous books are probably books that most of us in this room have read. Promises I Can Keep, Why Poor Women Put Motherhood Before Marriage, Unmarried Couples with Children in Making Ends Meet, How Low-Income Single Mothers Survive Welfare and Low-Age Work. Dr. Edin is a member of the MacArthur Network on Housing and Children, and she received her PhD from Northwestern University. In addition to teaching at Harvard, Dr. Edin's also taught at Rutgers University, Northwestern University, and the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Luke Shaefer is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work and a research affiliate at the National Poverty Center, also at U of M. His recent research explores the impact of the SNAP program on material hardships for families and barriers to unemployment insurance faced by low-income workers. Professor Shaefer's research has been funded by sources such as the U.S. Census Bureau, the National Science Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He recently received the prestigious 2013 Deborah K. Paget Early Career Achievement Award given by the Society for Social Work Research. We claim him as our own. He is an alum of the School of Social Service Administration, in which he received his PhD in 2008. Dr. Edin and Dr. Shaefer's joint work has focused on extreme poverty in the U.S., or families living on about $2 a day. They have detailed the growing share of families in the U.S. living in extreme poverty since welfare reform. And in their current work, Dr. Edin and Shaefer are blending quantitative and qualitative methods to examine more deeply the causes and consequences of extreme families among families with children. Today, in particular, they will be talking about the close connection between this phenomenon and the low-wage labor market, previewing the findings of their upcoming book chapter, The Perils of Low-Wage Work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Edin and Dr. Shaefer.
So all of you know about welfare reform. And I came of age, this is terrible. I came of age studying welfare reform, studying the TANF program, and wrote a book with Laura Lane about how you couldn't live on welfare, but you couldn't live on low-wage work either. Time passed, and in 2007, somehow Jeff Kling had a lot of surplus money and asked me if I had any ideas of what to do with it. And I said, gee, we should study what happened since welfare. We should study life post-TANF. And so along with Ruby Mendenhall, we initiated the study that you heard a little bit about today. And what I think the EITC represents an incredible triumph of social policy. We figured out how to give a pay raise to the working poor and make it relatively politically popular. And millions of low-wage working moms and kids, sometimes dads too, are benefiting as a result. And so my work with Ruby and my work with the larger team, we have a book coming out in about a year called called It's Not Like I'm Poor. I think really chronicle the story of that success and some of its downsides and ironies as well. But that, of course, is not the whole story of welfare reform. In 2010, I was doing field work for the Moving Opportunity Experiment in Baltimore, Maryland. We were hanging out with the young adults of MTO, and we've been following these young people since 2002. We know a lot about these young people. We've hung out with them and witnessed life with them and gone to school with them and work with them. And as I was living in Baltimore and spending my days with these young people, I kept noticing something that I thought was really different. Different from what I saw back when I was working with Laura Lane on Making Ends Meet. And it just really stuck with me. And I'll tell you the story of one young woman who lived in the Latrobe Homes, which is really in the backyard of the Baltimore prison. She was doubled up with her mom and her brother and her heroin-addicted uncle. And as we sat talking, the various times I met with Ashley, more and more people would come down the stairs at different times of the day. A lot of people were living in that household, very poor family. And what I noticed is there was no cash coming into the household. So this family had a housing subsidy. Ashley had a newborn baby, about 2 weeks old. And Ashley did not yet have any food stamps for that child, and there was literally nobody making any money. And I thought, wow, this would not have been likely in the pre-TANF world. And so when Luke Shaefer came, and by the way, that day we gave Ashley, who was really depressed and kind of demoralized, and she didn't have anybody to do her hair. There was no formula left in the house, kind of a dire situation. We gave her the stipend, and then we went back the next day to give her another stipend because we were really worried about it. We did a little follow-up interview, contacted the IRB overnight, made sure it was okay. And in 2 days' time, she had her hair done, and she was had formula in the house, and she was going out on job interviews just with that little $100 addition to the budget. So this story stayed with me, and when Luke Shaefer came to Harvard to visit that fall, we immediately went to work looking at the SIP to see whether families living on virtually nothing were really just a phenomenon in Baltimore or a phenomenon in the United States more generally. And of course, we use in this analysis both ethnographic material. I'm going to introduce you to some of the families in a little bit. And we use the mighty SIP, the Survey of Income and Program Participation. Do I have another slide, or can I quit? Okay, I'll be back.
So Kathy started telling me this story of these families that she was seeing and feeling like she had was seeing more and more of them. And I remember she said, I wish there was just some sort of data set where we could see if this has grown in the aggregate. I don't know if that was a leading question that she knew that I've been working with the SIP or not. But, it actually turns out it's a really hard thing to measure income among the poor. And there's no really any single good choice, I would say. But we certainly can't use administrative records because income among the poor, there's a lot of informal work. And it's so it's going to undercount income. And CPS does a pretty bad job. So the SIP actually is the best game in town. And I appreciated Greg's plug for it as being the best choice, as I would agree for employment instability research. And I'm going to be working with the Census Bureau. This is my SIP plug, and then I'll be done with it. Working with the Census Bureau on some trainings over the next couple months that you can come if you're not familiar with the data and learn how to use it. So the interesting thing is, this is a survey that goes back and talks to households every 4 months. What it does is asks a lot of detailed questions about different forms of income that you might have. And so this turns out to be really good at capturing income among the poor, actually really bad about capturing income among the affluent. But so if you wanted to give the most conservative estimate possible in terms of the number or proportion of families living under $2 a day, the SIP is where you have to go at this point. And Kathy was trained by Sandy Jenks, and I was, in terms of my data, trained in part by Sheldon Danziger. And they both take very conservative sort of approaches, I think, to these types of numbers. So we also use the unit called the household, which is everybody living in a particular household. So even if there are two families that aren't splitting resources, we're going to count them as one household and only count a family as living below this threshold if the total income is still below that level. And we're also going to try to be as comprehensive with what we think of as income as possible. So if you're a trust fund child or the family is living off investments or assets that are paying out income, then we're going to catch that. Now, if there are people who have large bank accounts and aren't actually making any earnings off of that, we're going to get them in our extreme poverty estimates. But we thought that was going to be a relatively small group, and we're working to sort of find out some more about that. And if you have rental income, sort of any source of income, we're going to include that. So we also sort of thought the simpler the better to start out with. So we wanted just to look at a month-to-month estimate. So we're just looking at over the course of the month, the number of households with children living on $2 or less per person per day. And this is the first chart that we produced that was published in Social Service Review this last June, my favorite journal. And the black line, the dark black line that you see, is cash income. So that's just looking at anything that's actually cash, not near cash, but actually cash. Earnings from work, earnings from public programs that pay out in cash. So unemployment insurance will be in here, AFDC will be in here. And you see it goes up from about 636,000 households with children in 1996 to, as of the middle of 2011, we're at a little over 1.6 million households with children. So well over a doubling of that line. And then we wanted to give you lots of choices in terms of what you thought was the sort of the best marker of this. So the darker dotted line is actually just adding in SNAP, saying, what if we count $1 of SNAP as $1 of income? And we still end up going from about 450,000 households to about 850,000 households as of 2011. And then we added in a few more other means-tested programs as well, so public housing as well as tax credits, assuming 100%. We had to simulate the tax credits. And you can really see, I think, that that our means-tested programs are putting a dent in this rise over time in the prevalence of what we're calling extreme poverty. But really, these bottom lines sort of only look like they're not dramatic increases because we're comparing it to the cash-only line, which is going up a lot faster. A final line that I think Susan Lambert made me put in was that very top line is actually, what if we just subtracted out AFDC TANF? We just said, let's not count that and say, income other than AFDC TANF, what would the extreme poverty trend line look like? And I think it's pretty compelling evidence that just to whatever degree, we've identified something that's not an artifact of our data, right? It looks like AFDC TANF is playing an important role, because if you look at the marker in 1996 and the marker in 2011, if we didn't count AFDC TANF, there would be zero increase in cash assistance according to this trend line. We'd see it trend down as the economy gets better over the late 1990s, and then trend back up over time. So this is where we started with, and we had this question that was sort of keeping us up, and then we had an answer, or at least a preliminary answer, I think, that was also keeping us up. Maybe raised more questions for us than answers. So the things we knew at this point, that when we look at a relatively short period, a month, we see this far more than doubling of the number of households with children living on less than $2 per person per day. From the paper, you would see this is most pronounced among the families who would have been most affected by welfare reform. We know that the means-tested programs take a big bite out of the rise, but they don't mitigate it completely. So we feel pretty confident in those sort of three conclusions based on what we had. We also put this, anytime you have an indicator like this, right, it's just a proxy for sort of a broader phenomenon that I think we're trying to look at, that maybe things are getting worse at the very bottom. And I think this is sort of juxtaposed to the fact that if you look at federal provision, as Kathy was saying, for people who are working when they're working, we do a lot more as a country for those folks at the top, but maybe we're doing less at the bottom. And I think ours is just one in a number of indicators that sort of suggest this is true. So we've seen a very large increase in the proportion of single mother households that are disconnected. Many of you in this room have done that work. We've actually are in the longest sustained rates of elevated deep poverty. I think we've been up over 40% of people in poverty are under deep poverty for 3 or 4 years now, and that's the longest spell since we started recording deep poverty as a measure. Marcy Ybarra and I have a paper that suggests that that there's actually more material hardship, at least as of 2005, among the deep poverty population, whereas there's actually, we find less material hardship among the near poor population. And just recently, we saw some new evidence that the number of homeless children in the United States is at an all-time high. And maybe some of you have other indicators that sort of should go in this slide. But still, at least for our work, the questions that sort of this first trend line raised were more than the ones that they answered. And so we started to wonder, how are families really surviving on such small cash incomes? And how do they end up extreme poor? And we're actually not going to tell you about how they survive on the small cash incomes. You're going to have to buy the book to find that out. But what we're going to do is try to give you a little bit of evidence today about why we think they end up extreme poor, among the extreme poor. And of course, obviously, the first estimates that we did, I think, are subject to criticism. Maybe it's only a month. Perhaps we're really just capturing a lot of sort of volatility among relatively affluent people. And maybe we need to look over a longer period of time. So we started this qualitative line of research, and Kathy's going to tell you a little bit more of our findings on that. We've set out to follow 15 to 20 families with children. It's incredibly actually hard to find these families. Recruiting at food banks, family homeless shelters, and I think the key ingredient is what I've started calling the Kathy magic, which is that she just seems to be able to find them in ways that other people can't. We snowballed from our qualitative sample members, and we've done a lot of partnering with research associates who are engaged in poor communities. And then at the quantitative line, we wanted to start just by using the SIP longitudinally. Let's look over the course of longer periods of time, look at the length of spell. Eventually, I want to merge in data on well-being measures that are included in some of the SIP's topical module and see, like, do they really actually look worse off on things like food insecurity than the poor as a whole? And we want to start to undertake some work that would more precisely measure the impact of changes in AFDC TANF on the rise of the extreme poor. So how much do we sort of blame this change in our safety net on us? So I'm going to present sort of two sets of new analyses, which besides Kathy and I have never before been seen by anyone. And I'm going to ask you to accept the fact that these are slightly preliminary, or I should say totally preliminary. I've done quite a few cleanings on my programs, but I'm not to the point where I can say that the numbers aren't going to bounce around a little bit as I can tell you actually that the numbers I already showed you are totally final. Mainly because I ran into David Johnson, who runs the SIP for the Census Bureau, and he complimented me on the paper, and I said, the results were so staggering that I always had a little bit of a worry that I did something wrong, and he said, oh, I didn't believe your numbers, so I had someone internally rerun them, and you're fine. So it was kind of like, should I be happy, or so I decided to be happy. All right, so anyways, we've been taking sort of what we think of as a conservative approach, and we're going to try to give you, I'm only going to give you a snap line and a cash plus snap line, but we sort of thought, well, if it's just 1 month of extreme poverty, maybe we're going to worry a little bit about that. So we're not going to worry as much about that as sort of longer period. So we're going to say that to be in extreme poverty, you have to have, over the course of a calendar year, at least 3 months where your family income is below $2 per person per day. And by the way, it's like a lot easier to follow children over the course of a calendar year than it is households, which a lot of you knew before I did, I think, and I wish you would have told me before I tried to follow households for a while. But anyways, so we're going to follow children instead of households just because the households are so fluid over time. But we're going to look at the household income of those children over time, and we're going to break it into two groups. We're going to say there's some that are sort of sporadically in extreme poverty, right? And you might sort of call this as extreme income instability, right? So they're going to experience either 3 to 6 months over the course of a year below this monthly $2 a day threshold. And we sort of riffed off of the long-term unemployed, which is at about, we consider someone long-term unemployed if they've had a spell of over 6 months, or I think 6 months. But we went with sort of saying chronically extreme poverty, folks in chronically extreme poverty are going to spend at least 7 to 12 months under the threshold over the course of a year. And then Sheldon mentioned what he calls the Wisconsin-Madison problem, which is apparently as Wisconsin-Madison, you have to take your, at least according to Sheldon, you have to take your 9-month salary is paid out over 9 months. Whereas at the University of Michigan, they're more paternalistic and they don't trust us to save they don't trust us to deal with the income instability. So they make us take our 9-month salary over 12 months. But, so there could be some well-paid professionals who do have these sort of spells of without any direct income. So we're just going to say that your family has to, over the course of that year, your family income has to be below 150% of poverty, thinking that, like, if you hit this extreme poverty spell and you were below that as a whole, that's a different thing than if you're a well-paid professional. And I've actually played around with that, this decision of 150%. And the numbers really look pretty similar if it's 150 or 100 or 75% of the poverty line. So, all right, so I'm going to just give you 2 years, and this is going to show you 1996 and 2010. 2010 is the most recent data that I have the annual longitudinal weights for in the SIP. And you can see, so as of 1996, if we are looking at cash income as a whole, this may be 750,000 kids, who experience sporadic extreme poverty, right? And then if we say, well, we're going to include food stamps in that, it actually has this sort of downward effect, just a little bit actually, right? So down to, I think, about 550,000. And then, like, this chronic poverty one is actually really small, right? This is like a handful of observations in the SIP. I think we're at about 150 or 200,000 kids. I didn't put the numbers up because, again, preliminary, right? But the exact numbers. But the bars, I think, will not change substantively. And then, SNAP's having a pretty big sort of effect there. So that's what we're looking like in 1996. So if you want to know from our two definitions how many kids are under this threshold, you got to stack up these two bars together, right, and say sporadic and extreme. All right, so what does this look like in 2010? So in 2010, among our sporadic poverty, so these are kids in sporadic poverty, we're at 2 million kids, right? And about 1 million, there's about 2 kids per household on average. So there's 2 million kids in sporadic poverty, and also in about 1.75 million kids in extreme chronic poverty. And so this is using our fairly, trying to be conservative, at least by what we consider as conservative. So what we thought was interesting was there was this sort of, criticism of the first paper that said, well, maybe you're just seeing a lot more shorter spells, right? But what this obviously shows is at least the bigger proportional increase is among this chronic poverty group. But again, we're seeing increases across both. And that's, I think, what we would really concentrate on, right, is the numbers themselves, I think, are important. But looking at the rise between 1996 and 2010 is sort of what we concentrate on. And the other thing that's worth noting is that I think SNAP, at least among the sporadic, right, SNAP's taken a bigger bite out of crime. Now, a bigger bite out of extreme poverty here, right, where it's reducing by more than half, and then for chronic poverty by well more than half, sort of the numbers in this. So SNAP is playing an important role. In fact, my wife, when I showed her this slide, she said, you're going to totally depress everyone. So let's just shave off that SNAP line, and you just look at the SNAP, right? And things look a lot better when you just look at SNAP. But still, even when we're including SNAP, we look at the sporadic and the chronic, and we stack those two up on top of each other. We're still getting pretty close to, I think 1.8 million kids under the threshold. All right, so maybe you think even 7 months isn't sort of long enough. Luke, I really want to know, what does it look like if we look over the entire calendar year and say your income has to be below this threshold? So we're going to get rid of sort of the monthly, sort of looking over the course of months, just look at annual income in the SIP, household income, as comprehensive as possible, and the annual sort of $2 a day approximated threshold. And this is really pretty amazing to me, right? In the SIP, it is 100,000 kids with the cash, the cash income threshold below this threshold. 100,000 kids in 1996, and it's over 1 million. So it's a 10-fold increase in this annual measure. And by the way, imputation, sort of rising levels of imputation can't totally explain this. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is it actually looks like extreme poverty gets worse at the beginning of SIP panels when imputation is lowest and tends to, so at the beginning we usually see big jumps in the numbers. So, and also these are only kids who stayed in the panel for the entire calendar year, right? So we're not seeing we might be seeing imputation over some of the year, but they have to be in the panel over the entire year. So we're not seeing people sort of dropping out. Okay. So even refinements, the general story remains unchanged. There's a sharp rise in extreme poverty, increases in both sporadic and chronic poverty, but the proportional increases are largest among the chronically extreme poor group. SNAP takes a big bite out of it, yet doesn't fully mitigate the trend. And so, the next question was, so what characterizes these households? Are they completely unattached from the labor market? Should we think of these as sort of the hard-to-serve folks that we were talking about earlier today? And also, sort of, what's the role of TANF, right? So, how much are these just folks who maybe really need TANF and are going to cycle on TANF over time or not? So, these are just sort of some demographic characteristics. I think this is the most boring slide in the presentation, but I'm trying to break down the sporadic group, cash-only definition, cash plus SNAP, chronic group, just looking at racial, household type, characteristics, and these are fairly small ends, so I always sort of treat them as sort of broad findings, and I haven't put up any sort of statistical significance because it is small, but I have stacked up a few panels and there's nothing weird in the data that's causing these. Interestingly, the extreme poor tend to be a little bit more white, non-Hispanic than the overall poverty. So this first trend line here, the first column I should say is the characteristics of families in official poverty as denoted in the SIP, and the rest are sort of the various definitions of extreme poverty. So the more likely to be white, non-Hispanic across the board. But also we see, actually sort of more likely to be married, except for this one case of the chronically extreme poor who are on sort of TANF, this sort of third row here. And this is an interesting thing. So I sort of thought of the folks who are extreme poor, not even when we can, even after we control for TANF, as being the worst off. And I actually think that's not the case. It's actually the folks who have no other income but are actually on, I'm sorry, not TANF, but SNAP. It's the folks that have no other income but are actually on SNAP who appear to be the worst off. And I've started to play around with the asset data, and I think part of this is a result of the folks who are chronically extreme poor but not on SNAP actually look like they have higher assets. So they seem to be drawing down. So I think this is a bad story for them, but maybe not sort of, the worst possible poor in the country. I get asked a lot about the regional variation in extreme poverty, and I didn't have time to code up all the regions, but just for all of you here, I did do the Southeast. I just picked one region at random. I found it interesting that 40% of the kids in chronic poverty, give or take, are concentrated in the Southeast. So there is some clustering that's not true of poverty as a whole. All right, so just a couple more slides, and then we're going to get back to the interesting stuff with Kathy. But so this is the household work effort and TANF receipt of children. And so what I did is I plotted, I said, what about, are we seeing sort of among these folks transitions onto TANF over the course of a year? Should we expect them to get onto TANF? So was there 1 month during the calendar year of 2010 when they were on TANF? And then was there 1 full month where there was an adult worker in the household, right? So I wanted to say, are they sort of more detached from the labor market than the poor as a whole? So it's only 1 month. I'm only going to require 1 month, but I'm actually requiring a full month. So sort of the SIP question is, was the adult working and at a job and working for the entire month? So it could be full-time, it could be part-time. So I'm not saying anything about the job quality. And then I'm actually going to sort of use even a slightly longer of the panel and say, let's look over the course of 2 years. Are these folks sort of in households that have somebody who's engaged in the labor market? So here we have all kiddos in poverty, the very first bar. So that's the trend line. So about 16%, right? And if you're worried about underreporting in the SIP, you should sort of multiply that by 140% or something, right? Because TANF is underreported in the SIP. And then we've got our only cash group, our cash plus SNAP, and sporadic, our only cash group, and then our cash plus SNAP among the chronic extreme poor. So you can see across the groups of extreme poor, sort of levels of TANF receipt are a little bit lower than they are for the poor as a whole, which makes sense, right? If they're by definition, if they're falling in this group. This is rates of adult workforce participation in the households of the children over the course of 2010. So what this suggests is among kids in poverty, a little less than 80% of them live in households where somebody works in a full month over the course of the year. Among the extreme poor, it's at least among the sporadic, it's a little bit higher, right? It's actually 85% of them are engaged, and that's true of the cash or the cash plus SNAP, depending on the definition you like. It's a little bit lower for this, this chronically cash, on SNAP group. We're at about 60%, right? And then back up to 80%. But when you look at saying, is this a group of folks who are detached from the labor market? It seems pretty compelling that the overwhelming majority of these households in extreme poverty have somebody who is at least engaged in the labor force at some point over the course of the year. And if you look over 2-year period, it gets even larger. I mean, you just actually can't get much higher than 96% labor force participation, right? And if we look over the course of 2 years, even among sort of maybe this worse off group of chronically extreme poor, we're still up over 80%, right? So the experience of a child in poverty, let alone extreme poverty, is one of them being very unlikely to be on cash assistance and very, very likely to be in a household where somebody's working over the course of a year. So just one regression table, right? So I wanted to say let's talk about predictors, right? We've got these kids, we've got observations across the year, and let's just say let's use this longitudinal power to say, what are the predictors within a kid? So we're going to do a fixed effects regression where we're just looking at change within a kid over time. So this is a fixed effects logistic regression. And I just threw in like a couple of variables, right? So is there somebody who's working in the household? Is there somebody who's receiving TANF? The number of kids, I actually sort of expected the number of kids to be associated with a rise in extreme poverty, and the number of adults. And I threw in the unemployment rate to say, is this sort of, in the aggregate, sort of related to changes in the economy? And as you can see, and I had to cluster my standard errors by individual. I think the standard errors are probably still a little bit more narrow than they technically should be. But I'm currently fighting with Stata to do things the way I'd like it to do. So as you can see, sort of employment instability, right? Going from having an adult in the household who's not having an adult in the household is a very strong predictor of whether or not somebody's going to fall into a spell of extreme poverty, as we're defining it, as is sort of falling off or getting onto TANF, right? So these are two things that are impacting the likelihood of entering a spell of extreme poverty. But you know, the pseudo R squared is like it's a goodness of fit type statistic. It's not sort of as clear as R squared in a regular old regression, but you know, 0.255 means that we are explaining actually a pretty good amount of the sort of shifts into and out of extreme poverty for kids. You know, with just a handful of you know, variables. That's pretty good. And in fact, the one that's doing the lion's share of this, right, is work. So to us, you know, for Kathy and I think where the quantitative work sort of ends at the moment and we move to the qualitative work is that we know that, like the rest of poor children, a vast majority of those in extreme poverty live in households where someone works over the course of a year. And it's virtually universal among most of our sort of subgroups of the extreme poor that someone's works over a 2-year period. A small proportion are on TANF. And sort of the employment instability, you know, using the term of today, is the single best and strongest predictor so far in our analyses of whether or not somebody's going to be in extreme poverty or not. So the next question is, what's going on that leads to the instability in extreme poverty employment?
So I'm sure you want to meet some of these folks. We've been doing field work in Chicago, Cleveland, Johnson City, Tennessee, and Baltimore. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the extreme poor families we've come across. We're going to start here in Chicago. We've got Jennifer Hernandez and her children, Caitlin and Cole, in a Logan Square shelter. It's not really in Logan Square, but we have to disguise these things. It's around there. Over the course of time we've known her, we watched her escape a 9-month spell of extreme poverty to work at a cleaning company called Chicago City Cleaning Services. And it turned out that she applied for dozens and dozens of jobs over the course of her 9-month spell of extreme poverty while we first met her. But CCCS was the only employer who would overlook the fact that her eyeglasses had one bow missing and sat lopsided on her face, and her gums were so badly decayed and discolored from lack of dental care that it was actually hard to look at her when she smiled. Added to that was the fact that her address was the homeless shelter. So Jennifer eagerly went to work at CCCS because most homeless shelters in the city, even the more generous one, will only let you stay there for 3 months, and if you don't get a job and move on, they'll tell you you have to go back to the street. She got this job just days before she was going to meet that deadline, and at first she was cleaning. You know, this company specializes in fixing up apartments between tenants, okay? So she was working here on the North Shore in opulent apartment buildings and really enjoying the fairly physically heavy, hard work. However, soon as winter came, Jennifer's assignments became almost exclusively foreclosed homes on the south side of Chicago. And of course, what made it difficult about these foreclosed homes is they had no light, no heat, and no water. So in the depth of the Chicago winter, this asthma sufferer, who has 2 children who are asthma sufferers, was going to the thrift store and wearing 2 and even 3 coats to try to stay warm, oftentimes bending down to scrub the floors to encounter broken glass or even wildlife, or squatting, indigent families in these households. Her hands were cold and bleeding, and the crew would often run out of water, so she would have to sneak into a a diner or a 7-Eleven or a gas station to get water in order to go back to the foreclosed home and fix it up. She lasted at this job until she got so sick. She was, because she's an asthma sufferer, that she started missing work. Her kids, in turns, got sick. There were several trips to the emergency room because one or the other of them began turning blue. And her employer then punished her for missing work by reducing her hours, so that in March she was only earning about $200 every 2 weeks. And she decided that the only way to get a decent job was to quit this job, which had her on call all the time and never told her when she would be off, in order to, so she returned to extreme poverty, and as far as we know, she is still in extreme poverty today. Susan Brown, we met in Roseland. She and her daughter Lauren were living there in a decrepit home with a number of family members, none of whom were working in the formal economy. When she had been pregnant with her baby Lauren, she'd been working at Sears, and one customer used a bad credit card, and this bad credit card for a pair of $80 shoes left Susan owing Sears $80. The store let the then new mother go, but said they wouldn't put a mark on her long-term record. They just categorized her as a seasonal employee. But it took her 2 more years of almost constant applications to get another job. She applied for over 100 jobs on the tiny screen of her iPhone. Eventually, Sears hired her again, folding clothes, and she was thrilled. She said, "I'm set for the next 3 or 4 years. This is my ticket." But a few months later, the store heard a visitor from corporate was coming. They worked 12-hour shifts, making the Sears pristine. The visitor came, delivered a letter to the manager. The manager was quiet for a little while and then called all the staff into the break room for a meeting and announced the Sears had decided to close. Ray McCoy from the Clark-Fulton neighborhood of Cleveland, and if you know anything about Cleveland, this is the highest poverty white neighborhood in Cleveland, heroin-infested and very, very poor. And her daughter, Azaria, we met last summer. She had been working when we met her at Walmart for 6 months, and 2 of those 6 months she had been named Cashier of the Month because she was so adept with memorizing and entering from memory barcodes. She had been working at a local Kmart, but with the advent of the new Walmart, Kmart had closed. It's also important to note that she had a lot of family trouble. She had, in fact, her father had died when she was 12, and her mother had run off to Tennessee with the lover, leaving her at the age of 12 alone in an apartment in Clark-Fulton, where she survived until adulthood. Because of this early experience of adversity, she tries to make family wherever she goes. And as she's tried to raise Azaria, she's found herself moving between a fictive uncle and aunts, friends of the dead father, who are eager to sell her their spare room for a good chunk of her earnings, but are very unreliable. A boyfriend, Azaria's father, who can be violent and recently dislocated her jaw, and friends who are all living together in a big house in Clark-Fulton, but are so marginally employed that their house is without light, heat, or even water. Ray loves Walmart. She sees it as a shelter in a storm. She memorizes barcodes by writing down the barcodes every day at work and then speaking them into her iPhone and then putting the recorder on constant replay as she sleeps so she'll remember them the next moment. She takes every spare shift she can since her uncle and aunt will watch her daughter. And she's taken Sam Walton's lesson that commitment to the job is key to heart as she works as hard as she can, preferring the busy day shift to the higher paying but boring night shift. But just a few months ago, a single crisis in transportation. She needed her uncle's car to get to work. She was paying him $50 for gas, but he drove the car on the weekend and used up all the gas. Led her to call her manager in desperation. Can someone give this 2-time employee of the month a loan? Can someone give her a ride? And her employer said, if you can't show up today, don't bother showing up at all. So although Ray had a lot of commitment to Walmart, Walmart didn't show much commitment to Ray. Several months later, almost the same story was repeated at a local Burger King. Three more folks I'll just mention briefly. Madonna, again from Chicago, mother of Brianna, this is from West Side, K-Town, enters $2 a day poverty. After $7 go missing from her cashier's drawer. And this is after 7 years of continuous service. Mary Washington, who lived for many years in Elk Garden with her 5 children and husband, and now lives on the near south side, had been working as a drug rehab counselor after making a miraculous recovery from drug addiction herself, but the credentialing requirements of the state of Illinois changed, leaving her unable to practice her trade and unable to find another. Paul Decker from Cleveland and his wife Rose, who are from the West Boulevard neighborhood, found that after their pizza chain crashed well into the recession, a pizza chain that they had opened with all of their sons, their son Tom and the 12 children under his care, their daughter Jade, her husband, and their 2 kids, and Jade's husband was also in on the pizza business, who all lost it all, ended up living with them in their 3-bedroom home. The home, by the way, was so worthless, it was only worth half of its remaining mortgage, but there was one family in the extended family that did have a home. When we met them at a Cleveland food bank, they were all living on a single Social Security check that Paul had just earned for turning 65. And food banks. And in Cleveland, you actually have to prove that you haven't gone to another food bank in order to go to a particular food bank. So it was quite amazing how they were surviving, and they have many stories to tell about how they made it through that time. And that situation lasted for 6 months and just ended 2 weeks ago. Then there are the near misses, and I just wanted to talk about one of them. There are many, because we have this very conservative estimate of extreme poverty, we missed folks like the Garcia family from Johnson City, Tennessee. They were migrant workers in California. Their son got addicted to drugs, ended up in Johnson City. They sold everything they had, put their money in their pockets, and came to Johnson City to rescue him. They were robbed of their $1,600 in savings at the Greyhound bus station. With nowhere to go, they went to a local church. The church gave them a van, an old rusted van, and $10 in gas money, and they've been living in this van ever since as they're trying to find work. And of course, they don't count in our statistics because their son has just turned 19 years old. So what do these families have in common? What is this ethnographic exploration teaching us? First of all, there is a remarkable commitment to employment. We saw it in the numbers, and we really see it in the data. These people aren't spurning low-wage work. Even Jennifer Hernandez, who is getting sick at her job, desperately wants to work. And we ask of these folks, what do you think the good life is? They say $13 an hour. Or if I could only make, Susan Brown, we just asked this of yesterday, she said, if I can only make my current wage, $9.35 an hour, she's just gotten another job. But I could work more than the 24 hours they're giving me. And this forced part-time employment, of course, is a huge problem we haven't really touched on today. Then maybe I could make it on my own. So a tremendous commitment to employment, rather modest goals, a real willingness to shoulder the burden of self-support, but very tough personal lives, which almost require, as Greg was saying, the give that many low-wage employers don't have. So unstable personal lives meet with an inflexible low-wage labor market and result in disaster time and time again. And of course, the weak safety net is Madonna told us, welfare is dead, they're just not giving that out anymore, is not helping to mitigate this for many of the families we're talking about. So most of our families are committed to work. They work when they can. When the low-wage labor market proves too unforgiving in their family lives, too unstable, they end up being bounced onto extreme poverty, but they keep trying, sometimes applying for as many as 100 jobs on a tiny iPhone screen. There is one chilling exception to the commitment to formal sector work. Ashley, who I told you about at the beginning, whose story led us to this explanation, was evicted from public housing after her mother died. Her mother was the one holding the lease. And her search to provide housing for her little girl after this eviction led to a career in prostitution and eventually surrendering that child to a cousin. So, I wrote about how single mothers made ends meet with Laura Lane in the early 90s, and that was a chilling story, but those folks had a floor of $300 to $400 a month in cash from the government, and these folks don't, and it does really make a difference. Thanks.
To open the floor to questions for Luke or Kathy.
Christine Percheski from Northwestern. Thank you for this really awful picture of what has happened. I'm curious about the number of families in extreme poverty who are married instead of single. That's surprising to me, and I'm wondering if what you learned from the qualitative interviews or in the quantitative analysis that could shed some light on why this is the case.
Yeah, I think that is still one of the things keeping me up at night. So right now, my best answer, I think, is that there are fewer ready connections between the safety net and married families, and so when people experience the spells, they're less equipped to access cash resources that are there.
Yeah, so in Paul Decker's family, right? Paul and his wife Rose are married. Tom is married to a second wife, although she's deserted him. And Jade is also married, although to ne'er-do-well, shall we say. But none of them are, for most of the time that we were interviewing them, received anything from the social safety net. It was only when Paul turned 65 and accessed Social Security that the family had any money at all. So there's a real reticence, I think, among these folks to approach social safety net programs.
And Paul, you mentioning Paul makes me think of the other answer that we have, which is a lot of these families are sort of packaged together. They really are households. They're packaged together, and grandparents caring for grandchildren, lots of fictive kin, I think. And our safety net actually is pretty bad at getting those people into some of the cash programs. So, folks who, according to the SIP, might look like they should be able to access that are told, well, the mother has to apply for this. And I think that makes more sense when you're thinking about combined families, that would be a higher proportion of married families.
So Scott Allard again, University of Chicago. In the qualitative work, are you seeing places where we could intervene? You see these families over time, and you hear their stories. Are there, from that, could we take away some moments where we might, reach out or connect or inject some support or resources to these families to prevent them from falling into these real, severe states of deprivation? Is there anything we could take away from this to do practice better, essentially?
Well, I think this fits in with Donna's presentation really well, but there are a couple of very consistent themes as you sort of go across the country and ferret these folks out. First, the affordable housing crisis is huge, right? And it's affecting both our cities and rural areas, semi-rural areas like Johnson City. As Donna showed, the growth in the demand for such housing has grown, right, in terms of people who need it, looking at their income to needs. But the supply of housing has not grown, and in fact, since the sequester, it looks like it might actually be shrinking because housing authorities aren't giving out new vouchers or recycled vouchers. So that's a constant theme. A second constant theme is in these extended families, drug addiction and mental health issues are almost ubiquitous. Treatment is rare, effective treatment maybe is even rarer. But many of these families and their extended families, right, have experienced multiple generations in poverty, and they really have some quite serious problems. Trying to think of everything. Yeah, I mean, I think the main problem, right, is the jobs. And so, unlike Harry, I think we would argue that we don't have the luxury of thinking of whether it's hard or it's easy. We just have to do something. The jobs are really the problem, and I think that's really the theme of the book. You see a lot of goodwill, a lot of hard workers, and yet you see very little. In some ways, we've organized the entire social safety net around employers, right? We've said we're going to put all of our eggs in this working bucket, right? We're going to create a work-based safety net, and you, the low-wage employer, are responsible for providing the kind of help that we're willing to subsidize. And frankly, all of the incentives for these employers do not go in that direction. So we need to work with employers to figure out ways where there are win-wins, both for employees and employers.
Yeah, with the jobs piece, I will say that I have a lot of cognitive dissonance where I actually agree with a lot of what Harry was saying. I think it's incredibly, at this point, I think it's very hard to actually intervene in the jobs. The stories make me feel like we have to, but just with ACA, where I think they actually tried to intervene in the jobs, we tend to do it poorly and can actually make things worse for people. But there's no doubt that at some point, jobs in the United States went down a track of disinvestment at the bottom, and that is sort of leading to this. I found compelling. I just read David Newmark's paper, which, by the way, David has spent his career sort of researching and finding that bashing the minimum wage in a very empirically rigorous way. But I wouldn't have expected him to necessarily use variation in sort of Walmart's moving around the country, which is exogenous in some, arguably at least in some ways, and finds that for every job that Walmart introduces in a county, 1.4 jobs are lost. And the jobs that remain, there's a reduction in wages. So it's pretty compelling evidence that there's a high road, there's a low road. There's also a lot of research out there that that this particular sort of low road, a lot of the things that Susan and Julie study in terms of scheduling, and a lot of the rest of you, scheduling instability as well as hours instability, we see. And there is a lot of research, and not just from folks who I think we would expect to find it, that doesn't pay in the end. So, anyways, I'm sort of open for conclusion. A lot of me actually still thinks that we just need to get money into the hands of folks. So I had this idea that, well, we find in our survival strategies chapter that a big proportion of these folks are selling their food stamps over the course of the year, or of the course,
Poor people in general don't.
Poor people in general don't do it very much. But the extreme poor actually do, and they sell it for 60 cents on a dollar. So I thought, well, hey, what if we just allowed people from time to time to convert their food stamps into cash? We could actually increase their incomes without costing us anything, because they wouldn't have to pay the penalty. But I actually think Donna is probably here, Pavetti, cringing, because turning food stamps, there she is, turning food stamps into cash is probably a terrible political idea.
I'm Elaine Waxman from Feeding America. So I was very struck by some of your qualitative examples. Obviously, in food banking, we see a lot of these folks. We went back and reanalyzed some data from our 2010 Hunger in America study and looked at just families with children. And about 40% of them, the respondents, reported fair or very poor health. And about 60% have medical debt. of some kind. So we don't know what that means in that particular.
That's the theme I forgot to mention.
But I'm just curious, as you go forth and explore some of the things that are available in the topical parts of SIP, that's something that we're really paying attention to. In addition, it's white women also disproportionately for some reason.
Well, some of the stories about the health of these folks is absolutely amazing. Ray, for example, Ray McCoy, is 24 years old and she has no teeth. Right? She stopped getting dental care at the age of 11 and got gum disease, and she ended up having to have all of her teeth pulled. She takes at least 7 medications regularly. She's got the health profile of an 80-year-old, and just really some stuff she inherited genetically from her father, who died, when she was 12 of a brain aneurysm, but had a lot of health problems. She still works at Walmart, but she carries her medications in her purse and puts them in her locker, and her employer at Walmart knows that there are going to be times she needs to sit down and so on. So she's got both mental and physical health problems that are fairly severe. Paul Decker, when he was 18 years old, he was working in a steel mill in Cleveland, and a beam fell on his foot, severing it from his leg. And he talks about how he poured the liquid rubber into a boot to make his own prosthetic, which he still from time to time wears. So, he's now 65 years old, but for years he's battled with really serious health problems. His wife is dying from cancer, and yet she is not on SSI. She hasn't, for whatever reason. The kids, his daughter is bipolar. Several of his kids have serious health problems. So these problems do really cluster among the extreme poor.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. I work at Heartland Alliance. I was struck by your story about, I believe it was the Walmart employee who memorized the barcodes but then was fired due to missing a day of work or potentially missing a day of work and not being able to get there. To me, that seems like a really bad business decision. And I'm wondering if in your research you were able to determine, is this an issue that's occurring kind of at mid-level, frontline managerial issues? Or is this some sort of corporate imperative coming like from the top that's saying, as a manager, you have no choice but to fire someone who misses one day of work. I don't understand that, or where you can intervene within the corporate structure.
I will say that her next paycheck wasn't coming for 2 weeks, so her message to her boss was, I have no cash for the next 2 weeks, and neither does anyone else in my household. So he was looking at an employee that couldn't come in for 2 weeks. But there's probably someone in this room that knows this answer better than we do.
So since both of you referred to what I think, either critically or, let's just clarify what that is, okay? And 2
Not
points.
critically, never.
Never, absolutely never. No, 2 things. I mean, number one, I hear confusion in the comments between quality of jobs and quantity of jobs. Because a lot of what Luke was talking about was efforts to improve the quality. Seems to me in these findings, any job, even the lousy loser jobs, are usually enough to lift people out of poverty. Okay, so extreme poverty, extreme poverty,
By
extreme poverty in
definition.
your charts. So it seems to me that the emphasis ought to be not efforts to, like all around the country, there are minimum wage things right now to push minimum wage, not just to 8, 9, but to $10, $12 an hour, as if there's no trade-off at all between those things and employment. I think we want to be cautious about that. There is some evidence. David Newmark doesn't bash the minimum wage. He shows evidence of disemployment effects, okay? And in a world where the absence of any job pushes people into this extent, we should be careful about the trade-offs between quality and quantity and exactly which we're talking about, I think, number one. And number two, on the issue of the creation of paid emergency jobs, which I do want to pursue, and I think we ought to push, but given how costly those are in a very, very limited resources world, the question is alternatively, maybe we ought to push back against this notion against the pure employment-based safety net and try to provide some emergency cash assistance not tied to employment, which in many ways would be a more sensible and more efficient policy in this kind of a jobs environment.
We're thinking similarly, so maybe. So the idea is to, in some ways, back away a little bit from the pure cash-based safety net and provide some sort of insurance against these unemployment spells beyond unemployment insurance. Luke wrote a beautiful few pages about this, but now he can't remember. But we agree with you.
Yeah. So I want to be. I'm really conflicted about the jobs thing, but I do think. I mean, in a lot of our respondents, they say that the time they spend at Walmart, Ray still thinks that the time that she spent at Walmart is like the best part of her last year, right? So even as bad as we see a lot of the sort of indicators on the jobs, I think they were a very positive part of her life. So I think in increasing the quantity of jobs is a good idea. Increasing the quality of jobs is a good idea, and it may be possible. If we can't do a good job. If we can't do a good job of improving the quality, I think I do worry about that we're going to do things that actually sort of negatively affect the people we care about, because employers are smart at getting around restrictions. So maybe the best thing to do is to just give them cash. So, I think the idea Kathy was referring to is, I thought of is that we could actually allow people to take a few years of their Social Security at a different part of their life. So we might raise the retirement age for higher earners, and we keep the retirement age where it was for everybody else, and say you could take those years. And I think it's cost neutral. But again, we have the trouble of finding anything that's politically viable. But I think giving workers the chance to have more flexibility so they can decide which jobs they're going to take is a strong solution. But we haven't decided sort of what the best.
I want to comment on this. So I don't know where to even start with this, but I want to start with saying that a week ago I was at Stanford and I was in a room with almost all employers and people in the work and family field, and everybody there, I was talking about social programs and policies, and everybody there said, no, we're not going to be able to improve those. We need to improve jobs. And we need to improve our practices. And so it's very interesting to have a group of public policy people saying, no, we can't expect employers to change things. We need to focus on policy. There's actually a lot of employers who, kind of, conceive it differently. I'm sitting there going, this is so bizarre, and to have this experience in the week. And I just have to say, the idea that it's easier to change public policy, given that our safety net has been gutted in the last few years and that it's harder to change jobs, I just find that kind of not very a compelling argument. The other thing that I'm struck by is that I think when we start thinking about the changes to jobs that could be made, I think immediately it comes to this, it's going to be higher costs for employers. And I just think we should avoid making those kinds of assumptions. There is a lot of evidence that improving jobs improves profitability. There's a lot of evidence. And so if we start with the fact that it costs more, then it leads to these kinds of arguments. But why start with that assumption? The other thing that I'm struck by these, these examples you gave is that how problematic it is that we don't have employment laws that protect people from just being fired at will for nothing. Right, where we have no grievance procedures. There are just a bunch of very simple protections that could be put into place that really cost nothing day to day that would help transform some of these jobs and some of these experiences. So I am not, when I think of, the ability of people to earn an adequate living and what is good for families and children, I just don't think we can afford not to focus on the quality of jobs. And I see it as no more difficult than what everybody here is talking about in terms of, improving social policies. So that is not a question.
I don't feel like I can stand up after that, so I'll sit down. So I applaud you, Luke and Kathy. That was another great example of trying to bring quantitative and qualitative data to bear on this question. I had a slightly different question for the both of you, since you both, I think, can speak to this quantitatively and qualitatively. And that is, the picture you've painted is these families seem like almost isolated entities. And so that's my question. Are they socially connected to institutions? Do they have other kinds of networks? And this is a key point, right, when it comes to getting reemployed. So they're not going to go to the one-stop centers. They're probably not going to go to the social service agencies, maybe. Or if they go, it's not presented as a friendly place. Is it the food banks? Where do we think of outreach to these families? Is one question. The other thing with the point of
Can I answer that one, and then you can do your next one?
Okay.
So networks are really interesting, right? If Paul Decker and his wife didn't have that house and a big heart, there are 14 children who would be in big trouble, right? And they did survive this spell of 6 months with all of these people living in a tiny 3-bedroom in terrible shape in West Boulevard neighborhood of Cleveland. But most of our families have very poor networks, and that's part of why they end up in extreme poverty. We do count in our estimations help from family and friends. That's one of our sources of income. People underreport that, of course. But Ray has really poor exploitative social networks, and this is fairly common. Jennifer Hernandez was staying with a family member who ended up raping her daughter. When she reported it to the police, the entire extended family cut her off. So the story of weak networks, weak personal networks, is very common, and Paul's story is actually quite uncommon. Institutionally, however, there are very, very poor connections between these folks and the institutions that we think of who might want to serve them. There are some exceptions. The food banks are ubiquitous, and if you want to find extreme poor families, go to the food bank or the plasma center or the metal scrapping yard or any of these things that help them survive. But Mario Small here at the University of Chicago has brought a lot of attention to this missing institutional piece in the study of poverty. And it's huge, and these neighborhoods tend to be very institutionally poor as well. So
the other thing I just wanted to throw out there, I keep talking about this, but it might be useless messaging, I don't know. There's a program called the Dream Keepers program that's been qualitatively examined within the context of community colleges. It offers $500 quick cash within 24 hours 3 times. And qualitatively, it's correlated with some stability. It keeps these young people in school. Is there something there to hold on to bring into this environment? It's not super expensive, and if we can help someone keep that job for the extra day, I imagine it would be cost effective. So I just want to throw that out there.
Like it.
No, I mean, I think this is a conflict that probably all of us are wrestling with in the middle of the night. I'm also wrestling with my 5-month-old, but it gives me more time to worry about this stuff. So what the minimum wage is this. I do think, we heard a little bit about the sort of the split personality of the American public and the fact that 80% seem to support a minimum wage increase. I think without even putting a number, whatever number you put it up, it's 70 to 80%. I mean, it probably, peters out as you go up. Yeah. But it is true. The minimum wage does, I think, probably have some costs, and it's a little bit blunt. But it may be the only thing we can do to increase job quality. But I'm willing to I don't want to enter back into that because I think maybe we'll have lots of time for conversation about how else do we improve the quality of the jobs, which seems like it's a theme we keep on sort of coming back to, whether or not it's something we all have good answers to.
I think one thing Susan was saying is that it may be that employers are this is what I was talking about when I talked about the win-win. Maybe employers are engaging in practices that look rational
Right.
On the surface, but actually are inducing big costs, like losing a worker like Ray. So, excellent research could help to coach employers away from practices that are actually hurting them.
Yeah, adding on to that, so we were reading in the research that one of the biggest costs to low-wage retailers is when things are stocked in the wrong place, right?
Right.
And also when things don't sort of get put into the computer system, and that's a huge cost. And when you actually train your workers and make them sort of a little happier to be working with you, they're more likely to put things in the right place. And then we went down and talked to Susan Brown, who's now working at Meijer, and she says basically daily people come up with merchandise that, according to the computer system, is not at the store. And the store policy is if somebody brings up to the register something that we don't have in our computer system, you have to trash it. And, that just seems like incredibly costly, right? But the question is, so can we convince, it seems like there are two ways that we could tackle this. Either you can convince employers that they're making a mistake, or you can change policies that sort of force them to act in certain ways. And changing a policy is certainly no easier than changing a social policy, right? But, maybe they can be convinced about the quality issue too, but.
To add on to that and preface it by saying I'm one of Luke's biggest fans and I'm one of Susan's students. So one of the pieces of information that was so compelling was about this unevenness and extreme poverty by geographic region. You showed the Southeast. And earlier we talked about the fact of TANF being implemented in a block grant kind of a way, which allows for enormous variation regionally. And I feel like what underlies, or at least this is my sense, some of the reluctance to approach this problem from the employer side is the sense that there will be all this unevenness. If we get one employer to change, there's all these other people who don't. We need a policy that will be universal to force these changes. And based on what we've talked about, these policies actually don't generally operate in a universal way. There are these employers that get around things. There are ways in which implementation becomes uneven. Before I started the program at SSA, I had approached one of my Congress people to say, is this something I'd rather do it this way. I want to make changes nationally. And she just said, stop. If you can convince one employer of 5,000 people to make one change, 5,000 people instantly have a better life. It's one drop in the bucket, but it's a big drop. So this idea, sometimes I think that we kind of come at it saying, well, it's such a small thing and it's so uneven, it's so unfair, but our social policies work that way too. So I wouldn't give up on the employer approach yet.
And we have time for one more question.
Thank you. So I think it's a false argument about better jobs or a better safety net. And part of what I was hoping that we would look at how a bad safety net allows for bad jobs. That people that you profiled, Kathryn, are available to those employers because there is no other option. And so when we define a bad job, to me it isn't only about wages or paid sick leave or not paid sick leave, but it's Susan and Julie's work that we have jobs increasingly designed to be sporadic, to be lightly attached to the people who are hired, and a bad safety net keeps that labor supply available.
Can I just add to the bad safety net comment? There is a pervasive, and I think it's really driven by funding, a pervasive assumption, even in our nonprofit sector. And anyone in a nonprofit knows it's not true, but they have to implement it because that's how they get their funding. That, which was operating at the shelter that Jennifer lived at and so many other sort of last-ditch assistance programs in the city, that if you only give them help for 3 months, then they'll be self-sufficient. If you give them a housing subsidy for a year, and by the way, that's a precious resource, then they'll be self-sufficient. I think, we heard today that this is not going to happen, and I do think we need to maybe there's room for more of an advocacy role in the nonprofit sector rather than sort of following the dictates of the federal or state funding that have these false expectations of self-sufficiency. Maybe there can be more fighting back.
Luke and Kathy, do you have any closing or concluding remarks to make?
Oh, I have one. So Luke really wants to know what it's like, what Jennifer went through in cleaning these foreclosed homes. So yesterday we were driving around Inglewood and we saw one. And some contractor was in there putting in windows. So Luke dragged me in there, told the contractor some story, and we toured the house. But I just want to say he's becoming a very fine ethnographer. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This concludes the morning session.
Thank you for listening. For more information about the University of Chicago's School of Social Service Administration and INET, visit ssa.uchicago.edu.